We start this edition of The Lead on News 24 with a major geopolitical question. Will the United States, under the Trump administration, join the unprecedented and mounting conflict involving Iran and Israel?
We've seen the US military posture moving towards the possibility of actually getting involved in terms of bombing Iran. So not boots on the ground, but bombs on the ground from the US. And what Trump has been saying on his social platform seems to be matching up with that.
This is the voice of our international correspondent, Philip de Vet, who will help explain the finer intricacies of a quickly developing situation in the Middle East next. Later in the show, we'll tell you who the GNU's most frequent flyers and biggest spenders are. And finally, that viral video of a lion chowing supermarket meat is indeed fake.
To stay tuned to The Lead for every edition, hit the follow and subscribe buttons on our Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels.
Stay tuned until the show's end to hear your comments. If you'd like to engage us on this episode's topics, you can send your thoughts and opinions to our official The Lead WhatsApp line. That's 072 562 3179. I'm back. My name's Graham Robenheimer. Let's chat all this and more right here on The Lead on News 24. There have been some calls in the past 24 hours for a ceasefire between Israel and Iran in the Middle East. But overnight, strikes exchanged by the pair have seen this conflict continue. All while all of us watch this violence unfurl in real time on our mobile devices. There's certainly unprecedented scenes as we're joined now from the UK by our News 24 international correspondent, Philip de Vet. Philip, thank you so much and welcome to your debut edition of The Lead.
Hello, good to be here.
Fantastic. I really do appreciate your time. So much has happened before we entered into this discussion today. The thinking with us and the rest of the team was it's been sort of quite difficult and challenging to stay abreast of all the developments over the past 6 or 7 days. It's nearly a week, right, that we've been seeing this conflict develop. Of course, we had seen US President Donald Trump. He's left that G7 summit in Canada, albeit fairly early. And then from there, you know, he sort of alluded to an escalation of sorts. He sort of sounded the alarm. And then we got this next sort of series of quite alarming statements from the US president. What has he said?
Look, it now sounds like Trump is certainly considering getting the US involved in a direct fashion. And that matches with what we've seen in terms of preparation. So the US has been moving tanker planes to the region, for instance, that would allow it to deploy its stealth bombers, which carry the very large bunker busters, which might be necessary here. So we've seen the US military posture moving towards the possibility of actually getting involved in terms of bombing Iran. So not boots on the ground, but bombs on the ground from the US. And what Trump has been saying on his social platform seems to be matching up with that. So he has suggested that the only path forward here is for an unconditional surrender by Iran, which everyone knows can't happen, you know, which is then kind of a prelude to the US stepping in. And we know that there are the more hawkish Republicans who would love to see the US involved here. A significant part of Trump's base are the kind of people who would like to see the Iranian regime bombed into dust. And now is the time. Now is the best opportunity you're ever going to have. It's extremely vulnerable from the air. You know, Israel has kind of like paved the way. So what we think is happening is a great deal of debate within the US at the moment at the very highest levels about whether it should go to war with Iran.
It's unbelievable because the latest update, as we discussed this, Philip, of course, you so correctly allude to, is that the latest international media agency reports are suggesting that Trump is now considering entering the conflict with particularly, as you say, airstrikes after he held that meeting with his national security team. One of the big questions that has been on my mind, I've also spoke to another analyst earlier in the week, and it pointing to where this all sort of started over the past last week or so, nearly a week. From my mind's eye, it's all got to do with sort of Iran's nuclear capability, and Israel was sort of concerned about that. But what can we point to as the main factor here?
Look, I can give you a very specific date on which this started, and that is May 2018. In my opinion, what we're seeing today really started in just about 7 years ago, when Donald Trump, then a first-time president, walked away from the nuclear deal with Iran. The US stepped away from a deal which even Israel's military commanders were saying was working, was holding back Iran. And everyone involved, so the Europeans, a lot of people, even on the US side, were saying that that nuclear monitoring deal was holding Iran back by about 10 years. So 7 years ago, they said we have a mechanism in place which will push out the date for Iran becoming properly nuclear weapons capable by about 10 years. Now, Donald Trump at the time, it was suggested, was trying to strong arm Iran into a better deal, that this was a negotiating tactic. To many of us, me included, it looked at the time whether he was really just trying to cast aspersions on Barack Obama, so that this was a domestic U.S. political play which saw a significant change in terms of U.S. posture, which then culminates today in Israel bombing Iran. Israel's proximate cause, the reason they're giving is that Iran is right on the brink of creating a nuclear weapon. I have not seen many other outside analysts agree with that. So the International Atomic Association, other monitors are saying that there's quite a big difference between Iran's capability in terms of creating radioactive material and actually creating a weapon. That being as it may, though, Iran is certainly not very far away from creating such a weapon. And you can argue, and Israel certainly argues, that this was the only window in which that capability could be kind of burnt back, where you could come and rain down fire from the sky and thus prevent a nuclear weapon from being available to Iran. But again, all of that started politically with the point where the United States, under Donald Trump as a first-time president, said, yeah, you know what, this nuclear deal with Iran isn't working for us. We're going to reimpose sanctions.
Excellent point. I completely remember that time. And then now, in looking in the latest sort of cycle of violence in the region, this conflict escalating, we've seen, of course, Israel trying to strike key nuclear facilities in Iran. What do we know about where the success rate of that at this time?
Information out of Iran is not as good as information out of Israel. So we're relying on, in part, what Israel tells us, in part, what third parties can see kind of from space via satellite imaging. It does seem that Israel now dominates the skies over Iran. And it seems that Iran had a shockingly lax kind of air defense to begin with. It reminds me a lot of when Russia marched into Ukraine and all of the military analysts were saying, oh, they're going to fall within days, and we were completely wrong about that capability. This is kind of the opposite. Everyone was thinking that Iran would be able to put up some kind of fight, at least. That has very much not been the case. Israel has completely overwhelmed the Iranian air defense. It now seems to be able to strike at will pretty much anywhere in the country, which is remarkable. A couple of weeks ago, very few people would have foreseen this. On the other hand, Iran has not managed to do much to penetrate Israel's Iron Dome. And that is notable into the far future, I think. This is the first time we really see a nation versus nation fight in which a missile defense system is standing up to it. So previously, Israel's Iron Dome has defended it from rockets from Gaza. You know, it's not kind of high-tech, high-volume stuff. What we're seeing now is a reasonably capable state launching ballistic missiles, launching drones, and very few of those are getting through. So from Israel's point of view, you know, that's a significant victory. But I think many parts of the world are now looking at that. You'll remember that Trump is pushing for a missile defense system, a very expensive one in the US. The success of this Israeli defense, I think, will feed into that. I think many other countries in Europe, certainly the UK, will be looking at this and going, well, hell, well. We've now got battle-tested evidence that missile defense can work. There'll be a lot of political pressure to build similar systems, even though they won't work as well elsewhere. I mean, Israel is quite a small country, relatively speaking. It's got massive defense spending. It had all of this US support, so other countries won't be able to replicate. But I don't think that will matter. Their politicians and their voters will be saying, if Israel can do this, we want this level of defense available to us.
Yeah, we've seen the G7 itself, the collective grouping of those nations. They haven't necessarily called for a ceasefire between Iran and Israel as yet. And at the same time, as things develop, Iran's UN ambassador says to the UN plainly that they're simply defending themselves here. And I just wanted to make the comment that also some of the analysis about the Iron Dome's capabilities has been sort of quite keen, quite interesting in recent days, because some of the missiles have obviously penetrated that defense in itself and has sort of struck. So that's been a sort of interesting sort of way to look at it as well, because we haven't really seen that before. There's been a lot of discussion over this ability regarding weaponry between the two nations. Like it's almost as if they're trying out a lot of their military muscle at the moment. Would you agree with that sort of analysis?
Well, except to the extent that Iran doesn't turn out to have that much military muscle, it's turned into a much more one-sided fight than many of us had anticipated. Look, Israel has extremely advanced infrastructure, capabilities, weapons, and intelligence. We're learning, as we did when walkie-talkies and pagers started exploding in different countries, that Israel has long laid plans and that it is very, very good at this stuff. We are learning that Iran, though it has been posturing for a long time, seems to be more comfortable with the kind of proxy warfare that it's engaged in to date. So now we're starting to understand why Iran was using proxies in the region, rather than threatening direct war. It does seem that it simply didn't have that capability. That said, we probably haven't seen everything that Iran has available just quite yet. Iran didn't want this fight in the first place. It wanted to kind of maintain this proxy war. It will probably be open to peace negotiations and peace talks. There's a lot happening internally within Iran at the moment, but the more moderate elements there might succeed ultimately. And it's entirely possible that it's holding back some of its capabilities, either in terms of a last-ditch attack or in order to have that as a negotiating capability, so that it can go to the US and Europe and whoever's mediating future negotiations, and they can say, you ain't seen nothing yet. We'd better come to terms here, or else we will unleash significant destruction on Israel. It'll probably say that in any event. Whether or not that will be true is something we'll have to see.
And as we speak, Philip, Israel's foreign minister Gideon Saar has now reportedly posted his letter on X that he'd apparently sent to the UN Security Council, as well as Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Apparently, he claims on behalf of Israel that them as a state was given no choice after, quote-unquote, decades of Iran's clandestine acts of hostility and threats by its leaders for Israel's annihilation. So that's the latest coming out thereafter. We had seen Iran's UN ambassador report to the UN that they are simply acting sort of in self-defense. I want to talk sort of quite broadly here from a South African perspective, Philip. Of course, you're in the UK at the moment, and before this conflict had started, we had already seen sort of some reports from the UK, from the Prime Minister's office, that, the UK sort of needs to prepare itself for any eventuality of war, and there was a lot of talk about military mobilization and capability and shoring that up in its own right, and that's been a long-standing issue for a long time. But here in the South African perspective, obviously, we've had the GNU government still under President Cyril Ramaphosa trying to play its sort of the peace broker role in the internationalist sense. What is South Africa's role, if any, in this situation? Of course, we saw the president himself with the G7 leaders on our television screens just a day ago.
In this case, South Africa is in quite a good position to act as an intermediary and potentially a peacemaker, perhaps even more so than when it came to Russia and Ukraine. Keep in mind, Iran and South Africa have quite significant ties on a political level, on a business level. There are discussions happening there very regularly, whereas South Africa still has, even despite the recent events within the White House, South Africa still has an open line of communication with NATO, with the United States, not so much with Israel. In other words, if there were to be talks here between the United States and Iran, South Africa has a role to play. If there were to be more direct discussions between Israel and Iran, which I must say seem extremely unlikely at the moment, but if that were to come to pass, I don't think South Africa would be a trusted intermediary on the Israeli side there. Other than that, look, there are going to be questions about Iranian weapons, where they came from, to what extent technology had been exported from other countries. I haven't seen those discussions yet, but I think this is going to reopen that box of worms about how did Iran become so nuclear capable in the first place, and, where did the expertise come from? Oh, by the way, did you know that South Africa had some of that expertise? So it's entirely fact versus fiction doesn't really matter in this context. I think we'll see some of the US politicians kind of like pointing fingers at South Africa and trying to bring it into that part of proceedings, hopefully unsuccessfully. But South Africa does have the benefit of being relatively far away and relatively cushioned from all of this, other than to the extent that it messes up the global oil market and the global food market, so yet again, instability elsewhere in the world will probably show up mostly in terms of things like food prices in South Africa.
Absolutely. Do you feel quite close to it all, being in the UK at the moment? What's the sort of discussion like? Obviously, we'd alluded to now the Starmer administration already sort of saying that the UK needs to be sort of quote-unquote war ready, and that there's more funding being put towards that.
Europe appears still to be more worried about Russia than it is about Iran. Russia is, this giant gorilla standing on the borders, and that's what a lot of the current defense spending and thinking is pointing towards. I do think this raises the threat level in the Middle East from a European point of view, but it seems like the attention hasn't quite shifted there yet. It is seen as a different scale of problem, a different type of problem from Russia. And that really depends, on where this war develops to, and what Iran's proven capabilities are.
And then, Philip, to sort of end off, from my perspective, seeing these social media channels on X, formerly known as Twitter, seeing these live updates from, like at Iran military, we really are living in unusual times, in that it's sort of quite disconcerting for one moment to see sort of a missile strike, hit a city, and then to swipe over in your device or to click or whatever the case may be, and then suddenly you're looking at a funny cat video, and then suddenly you're looking at an advertisement for moisturizer. It's very disconcerting. It's quite a lot, especially with obviously the very inflamed sort of discussion point or suggestion that we're on the precipice of like an alleged World War III sort of scenario, right? It's a lot.
Look, this is not the first war which we've been watching live and in real time. And funnily enough, of course, it was the first one that was really the war that we watched live was way back in 1990. And that also involved the Middle East. That was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The difference, of course, is we were watching that via CNN. In other words, there were media organizations that were on the ground that were giving trusted information on a real-time basis. And it changed the way in which we related to war and to politics. But it was kind of mediated via trusted sources. What we know now is in America, for instance, the majority of people are getting their news not from news outlets, but from social media. That's what the latest Reuters Institute survey tells us. So we live in a world where misinformation has been weaponized, where countries such as Russia, for instance, have active kind of information warfare capabilities, which are intended to at least confuse people, if not, misinform them entirely. And I wonder if this is the war where we will see that play out for the first time, where misinformation will actually overwhelm the real-time trusted information, and to what extent that will influence the eventual outcome. Peace negotiations, the extent to which voters put pressure on their leaders in Europe and in the United States. So that's my primary concern, this world in which we don't always know where the information is coming from, where we've already seen, AI-generated fakes circulate quite widely, and where we may know less about what's happening in real time than we did back in 1990.
Philip, the US joining this conflict would change the complexion of this entire discussion going ahead.
It would change everything, even without the U.S. involvement. The Muslim world is watching. And places like North Korea are watching quite closely. One of the outcomes that we're already talking about is greater nuclear proliferation. So with or without the U.S. putting bombs on the ground, you're going to see places like Saudi Arabia, places like the UAE, consider the 20 and the 30-year trajectory here, and I think seriously consider developing their own nuclear deterrence. The message here seems to be that the UN is not going to be a shield, that the United States can't hold back its allies, that if you want to defend yourself, you need a really big stick. And I think this might, in the long term, do more damage, create greater nuclear weapon proliferation than the threat that we ever faced from Iran.
Fantastic. And that is our international correspondent, Philip de Wet, live from the UK, giving us an update, a keen opinion article writer on the front page of News 24. One of his recent pieces entitled Israel Gambles, It Can Forever Keep Iran Contained in the Air, penned by Philip de Wet. Philip, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us on the lead with your keen analysis and keeping us up to date on a rather alarming and quickly developing story.
Only a pleasure.
To our trending topic now, and 202 million rand. There's an awful lot of money one can do plenty with, like starting a business and creating jobs to contribute towards the sluggish economy of ours. But this is in fact how much, according to opposition party Action SA, many of South Africa's cabinet ministers and Deputy President Paul Mashatile had spent at the taxpayers' expense embarking on numerous trips abroad over the past year or so. Action SA collated these details from relevant replies to parliamentary questions, and News 24's specialist journalist Carol Payton sifted through all of it to reveal the worst offenders, the biggest spenders, and the most frequent flyers. Social Development Minister Sisi Tolashe comes up as a travel expense worst offender because despite requests for information in Parliament, she's yet to reveal what her trips cost. There are also no real surprises that Mashatile has emerged the biggest spender, given reports of his 2 million rand splurge on London accommodation. Must be nice. The Patriotic Alliance's Gayton McKenzie and the DA's Dion George fly the most, in fact, racking up at least 11 trips each since taking office. That's not even account of all McKenzie's recent trips. Lastly, 3 ministers get top marks, if you will, for taking the least number of trips. They include the ANC's Barbara Creecy as Transport Minister, the DA's Leon Schreiber in Home Affairs, and the Freedom Front Plus's Dr. Peter Groenewald in Correctional Services, the latter of which has only really travelled between the country's prisons for oversight visits. Ever wondered what goes on in the minds of some of South Africa's most terrifying serial killers? Well, this month's free audiobook, only for News 24 subscribers, is Killer Stories, Conversations with South African Serial Murderers by Brian Hodgkiss and Nicole Engelbrecht. Here's a snippet narrated by Gavin Gomez.
It is sometimes the case with serial murderers that those hunting them are not aware of their serial nature until arrests are made. In several cases, it has been one offense that has led to the arrest, and then the offender himself will admit to many more murders. This is one such instance. On the eve of the dawning of the new South Africa in 1990s, the body of a homeless child called Sam was found at a primary school.
And finally, you may have seen this video doing the rounds recently of a loose lion scoffing meat off the shelves of what appears to be a supermarket. Some of the accompanying social media captions that emerged for this TikTok video, racking up more than 22 million views online, even claim that this happened somewhere in Mzansi. But our News 24 disinformation desk has swiftly debunked it, finding that the video is indeed fake. Because in short, it's completely AI generated. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it's very convincing and certainly had me fooled. Once the video picked up steam, other accounts reposted it, claiming that the lion and the supermarket were based in South Africa, quickly spreading this video like fault fire. But some telltale signs soon emerged, giving the video's veracity away, like the lion having two tails in one scene and a general lack of identifiable branding. Even the CCTV aspect of the AI video doesn't match up with how these cameras usually shift their angles in real life. What's more concerning, desk editor Andrew Thompson argues, is how quickly this low-effort AI-generated video in fact went viral. What would it mean for us when such a video takes on a more sinister context involving politics, public safety, or conflict? Let's hope we don't have to find out. From Middle East developments to fake viral lion videos, The Lead is back this week for one more episode tomorrow night, and then regular programming resumes Monday to Thursday at 7 p.m. from next week. Thanks so much for all of your comments in relation to our last episode from last week, Thursday, Streets of Sewage, an array of light in Krugersdorp, with our senior investigative journalist, Sikonati Manchancha, who's detailing his follow-up to the old Percy Stewart wastewater treatment plant on Gauteng's West Rand, how he uncovered the root of the unbearable smells there, and what's been happening since for the communities there. We heard from him that although Mogale City has pumped millions of rands into that particular plant's resuscitation, the nearby Kagiso township is still really struggling with effluent water there. Residents still have that daily reality of having to walk over puddles of sewage water as they try to make their way to work. It's unbearable living conditions. We got this comment from Rubber Duck writing, common excuse is lack of maintenance and poor infrastructure, writes this person. But you have been in power for 31 years. What have you been doing for a generation time span? Thank you so much for your comments. Please do keep them coming. Of course, you can engage us on this episode's topics, views, thoughts, commentary. Send your thoughts and opinions to our official The Lead WhatsApp line. Of course, that number is 072 562 3179. You can also mail us thelead@24.com. We've got one more episode, as I say, dropping tomorrow night this time. You can hit the follow and subscribe buttons on our Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels to be notified of that. In the interim, it's been a pleasure bringing you this episode. My name's, of course, Graham Robenheimer, and so long as there's news, we'll always have the lead.